International Potato Day with the support of Wallonia Brussels International and the World Potato Congress. So I would like to remind you to select your language of interpretation. A question and answer session will follow the presentations, so please select the dedicated feature in Teams to ask any questions you may have. We will summarize these questions so that the speakers can answer them. A few words about the organizer of this event, the CARAH, C.A.R.A.H. It is the Center for Agronomy and Agro-Industry in the province of Hainaut in Belgium. It is a center dedicated to research in plots, fields and laboratories, as well as to agricultural science outreach. It is a center that provides many services for the agro-industrial sector. As you know, potatoes are a mainstay of agricultural production in Hainaut, with 21,000 hectares of production, and we also have a significant presence of the processing industry in our province. Within our institute, we have a team that focuses on international projects, mainly on international potato projects, with work on warning systems for mildew, diseases, and pests, as well as seed certification and production. In many African and Asian countries, including China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Kazakhstan, Congo, Mali, Guinea, Rwanda, and South Africa. I've been told to speak a bit slower. Some examples of our work. The first and most important is the work carried out in China with the development of a warning system against late blight that currently covers all Chinese provinces where potatoes are grown, which you can see on the potato production map superimposed on the weather stations. This project has been rolled out in several pilot projects in Guinea, Rwanda, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. You can see an overview of the partners with whom we have carried out these projects here. Secondly, for 2 years we have been training potato seed certification inspectors in Kazakhstan. Thirdly, we have created fertilization software to advise potato farmers in Mali, and we have also trained technicians to use this software. Finally, we are also very active in organizing exchanges and training courses in Belgium and Europe, whether for young farmers, researchers, or technicians, as you can see here. Technicians came to Belgium to be trained in seed production and certification, and on the right, a group of young Chinese farmers who participated in an exchange program organized by the European Commission and the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs. So, let's move on to the topic that interests us today, the potato, a globalized crop. Grown in more than 150 countries, potatoes are the third most consumed staple food in the world. They are an adaptable, high-yield crop with great potential in low-income rural areas. Here we have a map of potato production and a diagram showing the leading countries in terms of production, with China in first place, followed by India, Ukraine, and other countries, with European countries in 5th and 7th place for Germany and France respectively. The more specific theme of today's webinar is how potatoes can help rural communities. We know that in many regions, potatoes play a vital role in providing short-term income for smallholder farmers, strengthening food self-sufficiency, contributing to nutritional security, and creating opportunities for market access and local entrepreneurship. We are fortunate today to have 3 speakers who will share their experiences in the Andes, West Africa, and rural China. The first speaker is André Devaux. André Devaux is a Belgian agronomist with over 35 years of experience in development research. His research is closely linked to the International Potato Center, where he has held various positions in East Africa, Pakistan, and the Andes, including Regional Director for Latin America. He has coordinated CIP programs in the Andes and contributed significantly to the promotion of native potato diversity and the competitiveness of small-scale producers. He is currently a member of the Board of Directors of the World Potato Congress. The second speaker is Bruno Vanderhofstadt. He is a field agronomist who has devoted his entire career to developing potato cultivation projects across Africa. He is the author of 2 technical reference manuals on potato cultivation, one in West Africa and the other in the Democratic Republic of Congo. His work has helped to transform the potato from a luxury product to an essential food crop in several regions of the African continent. Finally, we will have the pleasure of hearing from François Serneels, an agronomist who has led international cooperation projects within CARAH, particularly in China and other Asian countries. His expertise in potato cultivation systems and plant health warning networks is widely recognized. He has been honored by the Chinese government as one of the most influential foreign experts since the country's opening, and has received the prestigious Friendship Award, the highest distinction awarded to a foreign expert in China. Before handing over to André Devaux, I would like to remind English-speaking participants to go to the Teams Q&A session to find the link to the English translation. I now give the floor to André Devaux. Thank you, André. You have the floor. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to all the participants for joining us for this webinar. I will begin with a presentation on the importance of potato biodiversity and the role it can play in improving the competitiveness of small producers in the Andes. I have developed this presentation with Miguel Ordinola, a colleague from the International Potato Center in Lima. There are 4 components to this presentation. First, an introduction to the Andes and potato biodiversity. Next, I will explain the actions that have been taken to better leverage potato biodiversity in order to improve market access for small farmers. I will talk about the importance of biofortified potatoes in reducing malnutrition. And finally, I will briefly transition from the Andes to presentations on West Africa and China. The Andes are the birthplace of cultivated potatoes. You can see this in the photo. It is a huge cradle. The center of origin of the potato is located near Lake Titicaca between Bolivia and Peru, and archaeological evidence shows that potatoes were already present between 7,000 and 8,000 BC. This photo shows the great genetic biodiversity that still exists in the center of origin. There are still more than 4,000 varieties grown in Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. If you look to the right of the table, the CIP has developed a germplasm bank that is categorized into 3 groups: cultivated potatoes, native potatoes, 7 species and nearly 5,000 accessions, different varieties. Wild potatoes, which are somewhat the ancestors of the potato and had to be collected in the Andes in different parts of South and Central America, include 145 species with nearly 2,600 accessions. All of this data is used by the CIP for genetic improvement. There are currently 1,600 improved varieties available approximately. So in total, you can see that this collection contains 152 species and more than 9,000 accessions of different types of potatoes in the germplasm bank. Now, if we go back to the Andes, we can analyze the situation when we started working with small producers. Potatoes are grown in the Andes at high altitudes between 3,300 and 4,200 meters. Small-scale farmers dominate this entire region. They farm between 1 and 5 hectares. Often they are not very well organized. There are more than 1 million families in the Andes who grow potatoes. Potatoes are the basis of their subsistence system on 2 levels. Firstly, as a food source, but also as a source of income. Productivity is fairly low, between 8 and 10 tons per hectare. They work in a fairly vulnerable environment. This can be seen from the few characteristics I mentioned below. Climate-related risks are high, frost, drought, and other problems. Access to services is limited, with very little access to information or even the market. It is not easy for them to access urban markets, which could perhaps be more profitable for them. So, when we started working, we wanted to analyze the market opportunities for these farmers, who mainly had access to rural markets with relatively low prices. And the challenge was to see how we could help them access more profitable markets. At the time, we thought that one of the opportunities that needed to be exploited and that had been most overlooked was precisely this biodiversity, as you can see in the photo, which is rich in color, nutritious, and could have been really attractive on the market. So, to sum up with this slide, the challenge was how to help these farmers working in the Andean regions. You can see the type of potato harvested here, to access a more competitive market. That was the challenge we faced at the time. So, to start working on this issue, we started with the concept of an innovation system. So the idea was to start, as you can see at the top left, with these farmers and the opportunity offered by potato biodiversity, and end up with new products that could be introduced to the market with greater added value. To do this, it was important to start with research, so we had research results that could be used. I will explain a little later about the technologies and methodologies to be highlighted. To do this, we worked in an innovation process that involved different partners. Not only researchers, but also farmers, of course, companies and civil society, to strengthen this capacity for innovation, develop new working relationships, and develop alliances. And if we look on the lower orange section, you can see the access to the market up to the consumer. So this means to involve innovation and new methodologies in order to have better commercial innovation that could be appropriate to the conditions for the farmers. In order to realize this, we have this participatory market chain approach. This involves the farmers. We worked a lot with cooking schools that contributed to raising awareness around this issue, the options that could be had with the potato biodiversity. We also involved researchers, politicians for an inaugural event, notably, and of course, entrepreneurs. So here we can see an entrepreneur discussing matters with the farmers to see how to cooperate. I was speaking earlier about research. There was once a researcher who had the idea that he could develop chips, crisps based on the potatoes. And all the people involved in this innovation network thought that it could be great to develop this. It could really help develop new opportunities. So on the right you can see an entrepreneur who developed this concept, developed these so-called Halka chips, and there is a description of these different varieties, and you could buy them from the shop, from the duty-free shop in Lima at the airport. And it was the first prototype of such a product that could be set up. All of this involves research. We had to select native potatoes for processing. We had to develop processing protocols together with the entrepreneurs and develop prototype products, and together with farmers a better crop management in order to provide a high quality product. And we worked together with the Ministry of Agriculture on this. Here now I'm going to show you how all of this work started. It started over 20 years ago, and how this process of innovation could be developed. There was a catalyst for this. There's a slight problem with the slides. So this is a process in 3 phases. The first phase was research and development, an idea that was developed on the left-hand side here. And then there were prototypes of products. This took 4 years. The next stage was facilitation, brokering innovation, seeing with the different people involved how we could develop other options. There could be also gourmet potatoes or other types of products. And for the first time we saw that there was quite a high quantity and high demand for those types of products. And there was even cosmetics that were developed based on potatoes with benefits for skin health, for instance. And the third stage was about wider diffusion and sharing. So how to implement new methodologies for market research and market implementation. Based, for instance, on that prototype, the product with crisps that reflected a sense of innovation. So I can show you some photos of these colored potato chips developed in Peru. The one in the middle could be found in the marketplace in Europe. So all of this development is quite interesting. And in 2021, the Ministry of Agriculture took a closer interest in this. They started a study with consumers, and it was interesting to see that 23% of consumers in Lima preferred that type of colored chips. They felt that it was original and had better taste. And I would say that this reflects high progress. In 2008, this product wasn't available on the market. If we look at the graph here, the evolution of the price of the potato, of fresh potatoes as they are bought from the farmers, we can see that the price has evolved starkly. So it has increased. The price of the potato develops quicker than ever before. On this photo, I was telling you a bit about the management of knowledge and know-how and how to share it with different countries, for instance in Ecuador and Bolivia. And in Ecuador there was an entrepreneur who developed this idea of creative imitation. Since the market was quite limited there, he developed this product for import. He had to position his product in Canada, in the US, in Mexico, in France, in Germany, and in Australia. And recently, the Ministry of Production in Ecuador has decided to include these colored chips as part of the biodiversity of the potato on the market, and with larger exports of this product. To finish this component of the presentation, I would like to introduce key elements to promote potato biodiversity in competitive markets for producers' income generation, competitiveness, and food security. The first aspect is to strengthen the capacity of producer organizations to participate and cooperate in markets. And two key elements are the youth and the concept of entrepreneurship. The second aspect is to reduce production costs by increasing productivity and enhancing adaptability in the face of climate change for food security. And thirdly, and last but not least, a key aspect is to promote policies and services that respond to the needs of small-scale farmers in terms of capacity building, access to information and technologies, business skills, credit, and insurance. So this approach is multidisciplinary. It's very important to accompany this development in terms of the biodiversity of the potato. I'm now going to address the other component, third component, on biofortified potatoes to reduce chronic malnutrition. In areas of high altitude in the Andes, there is very high level of anemia, up to 40%. So there is a program of selection of varieties of potatoes that can address this issue. In particular, varieties with a higher concentration of macronutrients, such as iron, and also selecting varieties that are more productive and resistant to pests and diseases for more sustainable production. And an important aspect that has been realized is to combine this approach with educational programs on malnutrition, coordinating with farmers and also working with local communities to help these populations. We can ask ourselves why biofortified potatoes with iron are a solution. There is a high biodiversity of potatoes with its genetic variability of iron content can be used to obtain varieties that are richer in iron. There is also another aspect that's important. Sometimes we can imagine that potatoes have lower levels of iron compared to grains and vegetables. However, potatoes have low levels of phytates, which is an inhibitor of iron absorption, and high levels of vitamin C, which promote iron absorption. And an important aspect is that iron content is not affected by boiling. So if you look at the graph on the lower section of this page, you can see the percentage of bioaccessibility of iron. There are 4 varieties of potatoes with a concentration in iron that's more or less high, and we looked at the bioaccessibility of iron absorption, and if we compare it with beans, for instance, it is much higher. So this can be a very efficient solution. And if you look below, we should understand that in the Andes, in high altitude, the potato is really a staple food. It's a key component of their diet. Biofortified potatoes in rural Andean areas are an alternative because these improved and native biofortified potato varieties have on average a 50% higher iron content than commercial varieties. And if those potatoes are consumed at a level of 500 grams per day, they can provide 50% of the iron required in women living in these areas with moderate iron reserves in the blood, with ferritin levels around 10 microgram per liter. So the potato can improve malnutrition. It is not the only solution, so there also needs to be raising awareness, educational programs in schools and for these communities to make sure that people get access to food that's reliable and sustainable. To finish, biofortified potatoes in rural Andean areas is an alternative. This is a very promising approach, and to answer and address the key challenges that we are facing, it can be applied in other regions as well. I know from colleagues that now the Ministry of Agriculture in Peru is starting to promote this approach and is financing and supporting a project to disseminate biofortified potatoes in the country. So this is a very concrete example of these improvements and the contributions that potatoes, biofortified and the biodiversity of potatoes can contribute to the communities in a positive way. So we are now going to transition from the Andes to West Africa and China. I would like you to see the journey of the potato across the world. You can see on the left, the potato came from the Andes. In the 16th century, the conquistadors and the conquerors brought it to different countries across Europe, and from Europe the potato travelled on to the US and then a bit everywhere in Africa and Asia and other regions. And the result is that today potatoes are currently cultivated on about 20 million hectares worldwide under different agroecological conditions. Potato is the third most important nutritive crop worldwide after rice and wheat. And this graph earlier we said that there are 385 million tons produced worldwide, and this varies per region. The line below in blue is Africa, we can see that the percentage and the evolution it's on the rise. So we will mention the example of West Africa, and Asia is where the production has been on the rise the most. Production in China and India specifically. I also mentioned South America. It has already been important since the beginning. In Europe it's diminishing because there is a change in consumption in Europe, and therefore there is a slight decline in Europe. My colleagues will now mention the situation in West Africa and China. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, André, for this very interesting presentation.
Just before we continue, a few words in English to say to all the participants that are in the English language. If you don't have access to English directly through Teams, you can connect to the English by using this. One moment. Yeah, this QR code with your phone, or you can log on the Interprefy platform in English on your browser. This link is also in the Q&A session. So please connect directly to there if you don't have access in English to English in Teams. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Bruno Vanderhofstadt. Bruno, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. I think you are connected. Can you hear me well? Hello everyone. In collaboration with my colleagues Mamadou Kibali and Moumaïd Kaldeita, I would like to show how strengthening the potato value chain to increase farmers' income and improve food security in West Africa. We are first going to give you an overview. So here you have a map of Africa where different values are indicated. Average consumption per kilograms per inhabitant per year of fresh and processed potato consumption. In North Africa, the numbers are in red that are quite high. Then you have an area of West Africa where numbers are slightly lower in green. Next, you have the high relief and high plateau African regions in dark blue, and then towards South Africa in purple. I would like to emphasize the fact that the potato needs a particular period of cold to tuberize. And this characteristic of this crop is very important to keep in mind. If we look in North Africa, for instance, there are 2 seasons that can yield and cultivate the potato. If we are in slightly more western part of Africa, not in altitude, there is only 1 season that is appropriate for the crop, and it will start in November. There are 2 areas where you can find the potatoes in high altitude, Guinea and Cameroon. And in this context, you can have 2 seasons per year. In the area of the Great Lakes in altitude, but since we are in altitude, there will be a difference in temperature that is constant throughout the year. So there are 2 seasons for the crops: the rainy season, the season B and season A, and also during the dry season. You have seen that this period of cold is very important and will have a direct impact on the potential of production for these different areas. And this is what we can see again on this graph, since you can see that in East Africa is followed by Northern Africa and then Western Africa. If we take a closer look at West Africa, you have here different numbers, facts and figures from 2023 in terms of production. We can see that it's Nigeria that is taking the lead, followed by Guinea, Mali and Niger. Again, it's very important to take into account that there is a narrow production window. In the graph you can see below, if we look at the curve in red, average monthly and maximum, as well as the average and minimum rainfall, you can see the largest gap in December and January, which means that for all of Western Africa, it's fundamental to coincide the cycle of production with this period of time. From the 15th of October onwards, therefore, we can even say that we could have a minimum latitude for the plantation, which I have indicated by a red line here, because below this latitude you'll have a yield that is quite disappointing, since they are not in altitude, because as soon as you're in altitude there is more cold. Something else that's important is that if the cycle coincides with the months of October and February during that period of time, and during the dry season, and therefore it's important to irrigate the fields of potatoes. I will try to describe the production system in Mali by reminding you first and foremost that in Mali the major region is in the southern part of this country, in the region of C.A.R.A.H. If we look at the origins of the crop, in the vast majority of cases, it's from class A. There are also sometimes non-certified crops that come from Maghreb. In terms of varieties, we always use early varieties because the window is quite small. White skin, yellow flesh, and big size tubers. The price of these crops is quite high. You have to transport it as well. €1.67 per kilogram, sold to the farmer. Another characteristic is that the germination, it all comes from Europe. You have to condition them, certify them, which means that most of the time these crops arrive in a very young physiological state to Mali, and to respond to this issue, the Malian farmers will try to push the germination by putting the tubers on wet sand. Another characteristic that's important is that in most cases the farmers will cut the tubercles, the tubers, and this has the advantage of using fewer quantities of crops per hectare, and to also have high volume tubers. In terms of fertilization, we see that often They use cereals complexes, 15-15-15 rate, often in excess, and with little use of organic fertilizers. So they use very little organic fertilizers. In terms of soil preparation, it's interesting to see and to explain that by the end of the rainy season in October, you find the water surface that is below the surface of the ground. So they're going to dig a hole and they will plant the field around these wells. More and more they work in segments in order to irrigate in a mechanized way. As for irrigation specifically, the first photo you can see is a traditional method. Irrigating water manually, but the improved method is mechanized with motorized pumps that will help improve productivity. The use of motorized pumps also causes problems and water waste, and it can happen that there is a shortage of water by the end of the cultivation season. It is also important mentioning a few of the illnesses and diseases that strike the potato. There are specificities in Mali that are interesting to explain. In terms of the bacteria, we are in the sub-Saharan region. The Ralstonia solanacearum, one of the major issues. We can also see quite commonly the scab, common scab, occasionally. In terms of fungi, it's very interesting to explain that there are practically no mildew cases in Mali because of the heat, and it's very dry, so not in the climatic conditions that are favorable to the development of mildew. But this is not valid for Senegal or Guinea in altitude, where there are many more cases of mildew. There is also Alto Narioz, but it's quite rare. Early blight. You can also find bulk scurf occasionally, and late blight in dry season. The climatic conditions do not allow the development of late blight. As for pests, tuber moth is very rare in Mali. In Senegal, Algeria, and Guinea, the tuber moth is much more common. We also need to be careful with nematodes, to be monitored. It's also important that the C.A.R.A.H region is a lowland area. Since these areas are flooded during the rainy season, a large number of pathogens and parasites are destroyed. Potatoes have been grown there every year for over 40 years. It's important to note that during the rainy season, those fields become rice fields. Everything is flooded, and therefore a large number of pathogens and/or parasites are destroyed during that period. What's very important to mention as well in this section on diseases and pests we can see that in a large majority, we do not use pesticides in the fields in Mali, in the potato field specifically, because there are no problems that would require this. In terms of the crops, the cycle is quite short, more or less 3 months. The harvest is done manually. The yield is between 20 to 33 tons per hectare. In C.A.R.A.H region, on average 22 tons per hectare. In terms of the cost production, it's assessed at 3,810 euros per hectare, the equivalent of 2,500,000 francs CFA, and the estimated gross price per kilogram is 0.17 euros. If we observe the wholesale market price, on the graph you can see here, the blue line shows the gross market price for high calibers, whereas the red line shows the gross market price for lower volume potatoes. So we have peaks that are relatively low, €250 CFA per kilograms for big size, and 100 francs CFA for small size potatoes per kilograms. It will then be on the rise until August to exceed the euro per kilogram. There are farmers who have set up methods of conservation. You have one particular one that means using traditional boxes from April to June, which can help keep the potatoes safe between April and June. Other quantities can benefit from cold storage, known as refrigerator storage in French. Less than 5% of the production from April to August for 60 francs CFA per kilograms per 5 months. One must also mention that for September, October, November, December, the potato is being imported into Mali and being consumed. In terms of the gross margin, we have presented things with this little graph where you have on the right the sold tonnage per hectare and below the selling price. If we take the example of a farmer who will sell 18 tons per hectare and who will have a base price 250 francs CFA per kilograms or 0.38 euros per kilograms, he will have a margin of 3,700 euros, taking into account the production costs we have described previously. What's interesting as well is that you can emphasize the limit of profitability. So it's in this blue zone. As soon as the farmer finds himself in this blue zone because of low yields, he loses money. I spoke to you about the base price because in general the farmers can sell for slightly higher prices, especially if they're not in the C.A.R.A.H region, which means that we will have margins that are much higher and can maybe even exceed 5,000 euros per hectare. What can we conclude from this profitability. In West Africa, potatoes are a typical cash crop. They can generate incomes, but they require investment and therefore also involve risks. So if a farmer has not managed his crop well, then he can find himself in debt. A few words in terms of food security in Mali, which potatoes can contribute in a positive manner. The first thing we can say is that these last few decades, the potato has become part of consumption habits, and there is also dispersion of geographical use. So the region of C.A.R.A.H in the southern part of the country, but today the crop starts to be developed in other larger centres further to the north and in other rural areas. The potato is very interesting for food security because the estimates of the previous season, 2024-2025, between 350,000 and 400,000 tonnes in Mali, which reflects a turnover of minimum 70 million euros per year. Therefore, there is a striking difference with other African countries, and certainly with East Africa, is that the potato is not really used and consumed by the farmers. It is a cash crop, self-consumption under 5%, or only the small sizes and the damaged potatoes. The final point that's important in terms of food security is that the cash inflows start at the beginning of the food shortage period. It's very important as a source of income for the farmers. In terms of the challenges, how can we bring larger quantities of potatoes to market, responding to demand, while maintaining an affordable price for the consumer and attractive profits for the producer? It's a balancing act that needs to continue. How can we guarantee sustainability of production? We will try to increase average yields and preserve the quality. There will be a continuity of producer organizations. There is also rational fertilization with more organic matter and crop rotation that needs to be taken into account, and also management of sanitary issues such as Ralstonia solanacerium. On the market level, it's important that the crop continues to be diversified and expanded. It will come closer to the larger urban centres, so there could be a better price because there are good transport links. There needs to be a development of storage capacities, as well as an increase in exports to coastal countries such as East Africa. Another key point is the local multiplication of high quality seed tubers. The local production of seed tubers is technically feasible and profitable. So many projects have been undertaken on this level. The strengthening of seed multipliers is essential, and the continued implementation of the specific certification scheme is crucial. It's also important to continue the certification scheme for those particular potato seeds. And last but not least, climate change is a major issue and risk. There is a question of water management, irrigated land on perimeter supplied by solar-powered pumping systems. So water management is a key issue. We need to preserve it and use it at best. A second problem is the development of early maturing crops. Climate change could also unsettle the crop cycles. Thank you very much. I will now pass the mic to my colleagues. Thank you very much, Bruno. We are now going to hand the floor to François Serneels. He will show his presentation. François, the floor is yours. Hello, everyone. We are now on a third continent. We mentioned earlier the importance of production levels of China. Originally, the production in China is more about providing food to vulnerable populations in rather impoverished areas, but now it is also becoming an important vehicle for poverty diminishment on a national level. As we have seen for the other regions, the other continents, there are zones of distribution of the potato that are important, with variations in terms of crop production phases. There are major regions here that provide potato crops throughout the year. There are two major regions, the one in the north and this in orange, that provides for half of the production, where most of the transformation and processing plants are based. About 10% of the production, total production. A second area further to the south, from the southwest, that is more for mixed crops, that provides for 40%. And then the mountainous regions. In the north it's cold and dry. In the south it's more subtropical, but with the very disadvantageous high relief areas. Then you have also the tropical regions that only provide for about 10% of the total crop production. Here we can see the distribution of potatoes. The potato was introduced in the 1700s. It generalized in the west, in the southwest and the north of China. So relatively poor areas, cold and dry, or mountainous regions, where it wasn't easy to produce other key crops such as rice, wheat and corn. Up until the 1900s and 80s, the potato hadn't really drawn the attention of the authorities, and the potato was consumed more like a vegetable or as a snack to make noodles, because you can simply crush the potatoes and make noodles out of them. So the consumption per person is relatively average, about 47 kilograms per year, but it varies a lot depending on the region. In the regions of the north and the southwest, it's much more important. And there are also areas where the potato is a staple food, and it's consumed mornings, middays and evenings. It is a food that's considered for the poor, as opposed to rice and noodles based on wheat that are considered wealthier foods. The forms of consumption are mostly as fresh produce, potatoes that are boiled, for instance, for complete ones or in sections. As you can see on the table here, some full potatoes. The potato is also used as food for pigs when crops are have quite a high yield. Then part of the food is used for pigs. If you doubt the importance of the consumption of potatoes, I would recommend the little book, or even a big book, that was written by Studio Mu, the current general director of the World Trade Organization, and Xie Kaiyun, who died a few years ago, who had worked for the CIP in Beijing and collected over 300 recipes whereby potatoes can be consumed in China. In 2015-2016, major governmental change was enacted, and the potatoes went through a stabilization to designate the potato's transition from a status of secondary food crop to a fourth staple crop in 2015-16. This had already been applied to rice, wheat and corn, so those were the three initial staple foods, grains. And in 2016, the potato was added to these three staple crops. So this means that we are attributing to the potato policies, national policies as well as local policies, in everything from research to production, monitoring of prices for controls and regulations, distribution in terms of minimization of risk of famine. It's something that shows this change of status of the potato. And this is being adopted by companies, by entrepreneurs, by a range of actors. The major difference between the potato and the other three staple crops is that the first three have already very high yields, above the worldwide average for rice, wheat and corn, whereas the potatoes' yields are relatively low in comparison. However, in some regions it goes up from 20, 30, 40 tons thanks to mechanization. But it's more around 10, 15, 20 tons. So the potential is still very high for the potato to reach these yields, these very high production yields, about 40 tons. It has a very good nutritional value as well, and it also has a certain number of agronomical advantages. It's very highly adaptable. You can find it in a range of contexts and a bit more resistant to drought and cold compared with other crops. From an economical standpoint, it varies from region to region and based on the year, but based on the surface area, 400 to 600 renminbi per hectare, so 6,000 renminbi per hectare, 770 euros per hectare, compared to less than 200 for grains. Average income of a Chinese farmer in 2022 was about 20,000 renminbi per year. Let's take a few examples in terms of variations of contexts in which the potato is cultivated. So firstly, Chongqing, the west of China, it looks like the central China on the map, but in fact it's more on the west. So we are in the southwest of China, a monsoon humid subtropical climate with slopey microfields in mountainous landscapes. very high relief. On the right you can see cultures that don't have terraced fields, but something that looks similar. In other regions you will find very highly worked terraces. Manual labor is crucial here. It's very difficult to make mechanical labor in very small farms under 0.5 hectares. And as shown on the picture on the left, there is intercropping with corn or vegetables. So you have one line of potatoes, then one line of corn, etc. One of the problems that affects this region, is that the potato is produced without any rotation, many years with only potato. Luckily, there are no diseases to date, but there is one particular disease that may affect the potato in the future. Another example, in the province of Gansu, 1,300 kilometers further north, where you find yourself in continental dry climate with only 300 millimeters of water per year. It's too little for the potato, so it requires irrigation. We will find the setup of plastic mulching with adapted varieties. We will talk about the varieties later on. The region is part of the Loess Plateau at an altitude of 1,500 meters with a very cold spell. Work is partly mechanized, family labor, small farms of about 1 hectare. A third example to show the high diversity in China, almost 3,000 kilometers northwest, further north, in Inner Mongolia, the cultivation period is limited to 4 months, cropping season. Rainfall is slightly higher, 430 millimeters per year in the summer, which can provide the potato with what it needs in the summer. And next to smaller farms, you have these large pioneer mechanized agriculture with a much higher mechanization. This doesn't mean that you don't find already other tractors, but you have a much higher rate of mechanization here with tractors, small to very big farms, over 500 hectares, perfect for seed potatoes. 50 to 100 horsepower tractors. Not everything is mechanized. As you can see on the photo on the lower right, the cultivation is done in 2 phases. Workers put the potatoes in bags to put them to charge the tractors. It is perfect for seed potatoes, this region. We could mention other examples, but that's useless. Let us now look at some of the important factors that have contributed to the improvement in production. You can see the way the curve of production has risen on the graph, largely due to the graph specific to China. What is striking over the last 25 years, and I have been a privileged witness to this in rural areas, is a whole series of factors, such as mechanization, but not necessarily on a very large scale at first. Rather, intermediate, medium in some regions, with small motor cultivators of around 3 horsepower that increase farmers' productivity tenfold. Next, you can move on to small 10 horsepower tractors, as shown in the middle photo, and then to a whole fleet of small 30, 40, and 50 horsepower tractors, which are quite common. It is only recently that heavier equipment has begun to appear. As you can see above on the left, still far inferior to what we see in industrialized countries, but slowly it is gaining ground. Mechanization also includes everything related to irrigation, which Bruno mentioned in relation to Africa. Irrigation mechanization is more advanced in China, in regions such as Inner Mongolia, where large industrial farms are being established. We find large pivots irrigating plots of around 60 to 80 hectares in a single block. There are also large irrigation cannons. Another original system is drip irrigation, which combines a plastic sheet, we saw the photo earlier in Gansu, placed over 2 lines with a pipe underneath, and this maximizes water use. It is another area where mechanization is gaining momentum, is spraying. We will come back to the importance of plant protection treatments, but until a year ago, I would say that what we found in the regions were manually operated sprayers, which were not very effective because they were not very regular. Until 15 years ago, correction. But now, with combustion engines and increasingly electric, lighter, quieter, and easier to charge, things are changing. What is now developing at full speed is spraying by drones. In just a few years, the use of agricultural drones has multiplied in a spectacular and exceptional way, with practical applications whose effectiveness is not always convincing, but certainly interesting to follow. So let's move away from mechanization in the strict sense, and let's take a closer look at the different contributions to improving productivity. The main scourge mentioned 15 years ago was mildew. It is now better controlled than before. I remember in 2005, the television news regularly reported on areas where mildew was catastrophic, covering 50, 60, 70% of the harvest, particularly in the northern and eastern regions, which provided the majority of the food supply. China is an extraordinary example of the implementation of a warning system. There are 2 main systems in place in 14 provinces, and another has been set up by Hebei University in the province and the northeast. What is spectacular is the striking power of collective organization. Using a single large system that has dramatically improved protection in areas where potatoes are very important. The importance of training farmers and technicians should not be overlooked. The real problem that remains is that of pesticides, which we will discuss later. We must now move on to the integration of biofungicides into this strategy. As for the varieties, Initially, these were old European varieties cultivated by the Germans. These old varieties still exist and then can be found in remote rural areas, but the strains are polluted, impure, and infected with viruses. Fortunately, many provinces have set up selection programs with great success, and many local strains are now available. The CIP has also contributed greatly to disseminating much more effective material from around the world. Recently, some industrial varieties have also been introduced by large companies for processing. Finally, one of the main factors is the quality of the potato plants at the outset, which requires an implementation phase that suffers from a lack of certification, with quality varying greatly from very good to very poor. Traditionally, poorly trained farmers replant poor, diseased plants. The practice of cutting tubers has already been mentioned by Bruno. From a health point of view, it is not very interesting and reflects a lack of professionalization in seed production. Fortunately, there are more than 300 companies producing potato seeds. Rotten plants account for around 50% of total production. Fertilization in China is much higher. Around 20 to 30% more fertilizer per hectare. Fertilization in China is much higher, around 20 to 30% more fertilizer per hectare compared with other industrialized countries such as Europe and the US. With mediocre efficiency, there is an improvement of around 60% for 300% fertilizer use. This is linked to the use of unbalanced fertilization. So, a lot of fertilizer is used, but not necessarily with the necessary elements. It should be remembered that for potatoes, a sufficient supply of potassium is very important. So using formulas such as 13, 17, 15 is already better than 15, 15, 15 that Bruno was talking about for Africa earlier, but it's still not necessarily ideal. You can see a special case in the orange and yellow areas on this map, soils with acidicity, around 4 to 5, which is very acidic, block some of the nutrients. Above, you can see a map of a district where we have done a lot of work. The red areas are very acidic, with pH levels around 4, and in these areas, there is an agronomic method that increases yields by 20% in one go. 1,500 kilograms per hectare. There is still a lot of work to be done in terms of pH management in certain soils. The products and the processing of potatoes into different products involve the extraction of starch. At present, only 600,000 tons of starch are produced compared to 96 million tons of potatoes, and this remains confidential. This starch is used to make around 300,000 tons of noodles and can be used in many other ingredients. One of the government's current policies is to change the regulations on the use of starch so that it can be mixed with flour in preparations such as bread, cakes, pastries, biscuits, etc. There are also specific efforts in terms of controlled designation of origin or designations for specific enriched projects. And I'm thinking in particular of the example of selenium-rich potatoes produced in the Hubei region, which has particularly selenium-rich soils, given that in some regions of China there are pathological selenium deficiencies. The traditional industrial sector, as we know it in industrialized countries, is also developing, with 390,000 tons of potato chips, 370,000 tons of reconstituted potato chips, and frozen French fries, which are also growing, with one company being questioned. Belgium is the world leader in frozen French fried exports. It is perfectly normal for the local market to be supplied by local frozen French fries. The role of public services is truly fundamental. This is one of the things that I have observed very clearly, such as the warning system for combating late blight or the mildew. Without the support of public services, we would certainly not be where we are now. And what is also striking is the intensity of the efforts being made at the local level. We are targeting areas where potatoes are very important, and we are pulling out all the stops, and we are achieving results that are nevertheless very interesting, particularly in terms of poverty reduction, which is a strategic objective of the public authorities. What is sometimes regrettable is the lack of coordination between certain services, for example, between those responsible for disease control and those responsible for soil analysis. There is perhaps not enough communication at this level and a lack of integrated vision of agriculture. The problems have already been mentioned: over-fertilization, which causes problems with water and water quality, soil degradation when soil is cultivated in poor conditions, and reduced yields. The problem of pesticides is certainly very acute, particularly in relation to the high population density in many areas. So once again, water pollution from pesticides, and you can see the packaging completely neglected above on the top right-hand corner. Workers' exposure to pesticides with very little awareness among those who are most exposed. And of course, the risk of pathogens developing resistance, particularly with systemic products, which are spectacularly effective but prove to be harmful in the medium term. We can also mention the problem of energy use and limited resources in fertilizers and minerals, and of course climate change. But here the potato is perhaps a little favored because it is more resistant to drought than other crops, and the warming of certain regions could open up new growing areas for it. The sustainability of potatoes has recently been well illustrated by a number of sophisticated studies, including a comparison of the multifactorial footprint on water. The graphs show, without going into detail, that potatoes is the very small pink area at the top of the bars. We can see that the impact of potatoes is relatively more limited than that of rice, wheat or corn. This confirms the value of the potato staple food policy, which aims to strengthen the position of potatoes as a staple food. However, certain conditions, say some researchers, including increasing the promotion of potatoes as a nutritionally interesting food among part of the Chinese public. In all eastern areas in particular, there are rarely consumers to be reached. The second interesting condition, the industry must continue to be encouraged to process potatoes as a substitute for wheat, to make more noodles, more flour, and more starch to be mixed into flours for pastry and bakery products. Research should also be promoted, particularly into varieties with high yields and performance suited to local conditions. And finally, food security policies and environmental sustainability policies should be well coordinated. If I had to pick 3 important lessons, I would say first, that potatoes really do have significant potential in China, in certain regions, not everywhere. There are lots of regions where it's not really the right solution, but there are a number of regions where there really is enormous potential. The role of coherent policies is fundamental. Where the authorities put their weight behind it, it works impressively well. And finally, while research is important, it is necessary to adapt to local conditions, and extension is absolutely fundamental. Places where awareness and outreach is insufficient fail to take off. So there is a need for both agricultural research to improve potato performance in its content. But we also need to put in sufficient resources into training the actors, the main operators, who are obviously the farmers. That's it. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, François, for your presentation. We will now move quickly to the conclusions. Before that, I would like to remind you that you can still ask questions in the Q&A tab in Teams. We will answer them after the conclusions. Before I forget, I would also like to remind you that all of these presentations will be available online in all 3 languages. Those who registered via Eventbrite, you will receive a link to the content, which will also be shared on the CARAH website and CARAH's social media channels. In conclusion, we have seen throughout these 3 presentations that potatoes are an effective solution to global challenges, particularly in terms of resilience, thanks to its high yield, adaptability to different agroecological systems, relatively short growing cycle compared to other crops, and low carbon footprint, again compared to other crops. In terms of subsistence and income for farmers in disadvantaged rural areas, the potato plays a dual role in the family economy as a cash crop and as food for domestic consumption. When produced locally, it can play an important role in food crises, and demand for processed potatoes is increasing in countries in the south, generating added value locally. Finally, in terms of energy and nutrition, the potato is a nutritious, energy-rich food and an excellent source of vitamin C, potassium, and dietary fiber. It also contains micronutrients, such as iron and zinc. Let us now turn to the challenges facing potato cultivation in 2025. According to the presentations by our 3 speakers, the potato faces challenges in terms of agri-food and agronomic sustainability. The following issues were highlighted: misuse of agricultural inputs, particularly pesticides and fertilizers, problems with limited or non-existent crop rotation, soil degradation, problems with water management, disease control, and last but not least, limited access to healthy and certified potato plants, even in countries where this is being organized. Secondly, as with all crops, climate change is a factor. There is a risk of increased vulnerability of potato-based systems, although, as François explained, it is probably not the crop that will be most affected. Finally, there is a post-harvest constraint and a market aspect to consider with, as Bruno pointed out, problems of lack of storage infrastructure, fragmented market access for small producers, and a lack of visibility for local varieties, as André explained very well. If we look at all these challenges, how can we respond to them? We could, for small If we can summarize this in 5 points, there is a need for coordinated public support. I think the example of China shows that this works. There is a need for research, which is always necessary. There is a need for outreach, technical support for producers, and access to agricultural services. And there is a need for market incentives. And finally, one of the solutions for moving forward could be the establishment of public-private partnerships. Thank you for your attention. We will now move on to the question and answer session. If you would like to contact us, the C.A.R.A.H International Agronomy Service, or pass on your questions to the speakers afterwards, please feel free to send us an email at the address shown here.